webinar series. My name is David Franker. I'm the head of marketing here at Genscape. And today we'll be presenting the Understanding MISO Interface Pricing with a Focus on PJMC webinar. Lauren Saliga, our MISO Regional Director, will be presenting. Joining her is John Tapatis and Rush Milam, both analysts on the MISO teams. After Lauren's presentation, we're going to show the audience a demo of our MISO Power IQ and Transmission RT products. Transmission RT is a brand new product. This is the first presentation. You'll see a lot more about that in the near future. It allows you to monitor and watch real-time power constraints. And in this part of the presentation, Lauren will explain how Power IQ and Transmission RT can be used to help you identify opportunities as they pertain to analyzing and trading PJMC. Throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to ask questions, and we'll do our best to answer them all at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lauren. Lauren?
Thank you, David. So today we're going to be looking at PJMC and how it relates to MISO. Just go over what David's already mentioned. Sorry, folks, we're just waiting for the slide to move here. So just to look, we're taking a look at Genscape here. It is the originator of real-time power information and fundamentals-driven market intelligence to help support decision-making for wholesale power participants. John, Rush, and I all work in the market intelligence side of Genscape, focused in the Boston office. We're issuing reports on a daily basis to help provide insight and analysis into a number of topics, including day-ahead and real-time trading opportunities, demand and weather risks, generation and transmission outages, congestion risks, and fuel pricing. If at any point in time during the presentation you do have a question, as David noted, please feel free to ask a question via the GoToWebinar. Again, as we mentioned, I'm Lauren Saliga, the Regional Director of the MISO team, and John Tapatis, an analyst. So on today's agenda, we're going to focus on what PJMC is, first by looking at the nodal definition of PJMC and the actual geographic location of these points. We're also going to be looking at the relationship between PJMC, PJM, and MISO, and the correlation and average spreads with each of the major hubs in both of our RTOs. We're also going to be looking at the drivers of any significant price blowouts. Then we're going to move on to PJMC and real-time operations, looking at PJMC and wind generation, and also PJMC and real-time flows. Then John is going to take a look at PJMC and MISO congestion, and looking at the top bullish and bearish constraints as it pertains to that pricing point. Lastly, we're going to wrap up by looking at PJMC and other interfaces, especially the on pricing point. So what is PJMC? PJMC is a point used to price physical power flows between MISO and PJM. Since these flows comprise only 25% of all flows in and out of MISO, it is essential to understand what drives these flows if you want to understand what impacts Indy Hub prices, West Hub prices, and congestion on the MISO PJMC. More formally, MISO defines the interface as a weighting of EP nodes to reflect an interchange schedule with external balancing authorities. Other balancing authorities to note include IESO or Ontario to the north, TVA and SPP to the south, and more interestingly enough, the Entergy interface down to the southeast, which is going to be joining the MISO footprint come December of this year. So taking a look at the MISO nodal definition, you can see that there are a number of significant PJM generators on this list, including Susquehanna, Calvert Cliff, Conemaugh, Chalk Point, and Peach Bottom. And here we've plotted them on the Genscape real-time interface, just to give you a sense of where these are really focused and located. As you can see, they're mainly focused on the eastern seaboard, furthest away from the MISO footprint, in an area which was once known as PJM Classic, hence we use the term PJM. On this slide, we're taking a look at percentage breakdown by zone within PJM that each of these nodes is in. So as you can see, Penelec and PCO making it the strongest percentages at 17% and 16% respectively. Now we're going to take a look at PJMC and PJM. First, we're going to look at the correlations between PJMC and the real-time pricing hubs for all of those within PJM, with a special focus on West Hub, AD Hub, and NI Hub. Looking at the correlations, they are fairly low, especially with West Hub. You're only about a 58% correlation, whereas AD and NI Hubs are about 64. The spreads, you can see that PJMC actually trades at a discount to West Hub by about $6. It's also at a discount to AD and NI. For AD, it's about a $4 discount, and for NI, it's about $3. Taking a look at kind of the largest drivers of separation we have, more specifically on certain dates of interest were kind of July 5th of the past year, 2012, and then also a large bearish separation of July 17th, 2012. What we're seeing here is that demand and commitment levels are the main drivers of PJMC and PJM hub spread blowouts. Undercommitment in MISO or congestion is going to help to contribute to wide spreads between PJMC and West Hub, and stronger levels of commitment in MISO versus PJM are going to lead to a negative spread. And just to kind of understand the chart a little better, when you're seeing red in either the commitment or generation tabs, that's going to indicate a poor level of commitment or a poor amount of available generation, whereas red in the demand tab is really going to show that you're at a seasonal high. Yellow, you're looking at a much more moderate level of demand and a more moderate level of commitment and generation, where you may have a concern for 1 or 2 hours. Green, you're looking at a pretty weak seasonal demand, and then a good amount of available generation and a decent level of commitment. Now we're going to take a look at PJMC and MISO. For PJMC prices versus the main hubs in MISO, including Indy, Mich, Illinois, and Minnesota, you can see a much higher correlation, especially with Indy and Mich hubs, which are both 90% or greater. Illinois just not making the margin just ever so slightly, and you're around 87% there, and then Minnesota hub, you're around 69%. Again, you kind of see a separation here between PJMC and the actual spread, with Indy and Mich actually trading at a premium by about $1 and $2.50 for Mich. And then for Illinois and Min, you're seeing them actually trade at a discount to PJMC. We're going to get into the reasons why a little bit later in the presentation. Next, again, similar to the analysis for PJM, we're going to look at the major drivers between that PJMC and Indy hub price. Again, you're seeing the greatest driver around July 5th with hub. And again, you're seeing very similar drivers, a function of demand, commitment levels, and supply. Again, the legend here is the exact same as the previous slide. And you're seeing undercommitment in MISO or congestion, helping to contribute to wide spreads between PJMC and Indy, whereas stronger levels of commitment and weaker loads in MISO versus those in PJM are going to lead to a negative spread. Lastly, we're going to take a look at PJMC and real-time flow. Looking at wind generation and its impact on PJMC, obviously a lot of wind generation within the MISO footprint, and installed capacity obviously increasing on an almost 3-month basis. What we're seeing here is that overall, strong real-time wind generation in that MISO footprint is going to suppress prices, including the PJMC price. Looking at this relationship a little more closely, you're going to see a roughly negative 20% correlation, indicating that stronger wind generation is going to keep those prices on the PJMC LNG low. And you can see that here on the graph. When that green line actually starts to get greater, you see those LNG prices on the yellow line stay a little bit weaker. And then when that wind starts coming down in a little bit more seasonal levels, you do see those yellow prices actually start to spike up. Here we're also going to take a look at the changes in real-time flows in PJMC. Looking at specific hours where you had a great deviation, either in the positive or negative direction, you're looking at a change in actual flows from PJM into MISO. So if you see a large actual spread in that PJMC price, you're going to see an increase in flows. And the same actually goes for negative spreads. If you take a look at the data from July 6th of this year, you're going to see a decrease in flows, price, by about $200, but an actual increase in flows in the next hour by 1,000 megawatts. And on average, you see about a 200 megawatt gain for any large movement in PJMC. So just to wrap it up here, to better predict flows, it's useful to look at the commitment within both MISO and PJM instead of the actual PJMC price. To calculate this, we're using a commitment level determined by looking at the difference between the MISO midterm load forecast, or MTLF, and clear demand. And that gives us about a 20% correlation between that value and real-time flows with PJM. And you're looking at a little bit more of an updated information on that MISO portal that correlation is then going to jump to about 30%. Now let's turn it over to John Pottis to walk us through MISO congestion.
Thanks, Lauren. David again. Just want to jump in. We're seeing people ask if they can still submit questions, and just encourage everyone, please don't hesitate. Send in any questions that you have, and John and Rush are going to go ahead and answer them as they come through.
Thanks, David. Right now we're going to jump into congestion and how it relates to PJMC and the different MISO hubs. So the first thing that we want to take a look at in this graph, we saw congestion over 2012 for the different MISO hubs, and we're seeing right now how they match up with that of PJMC. If you take a look at our correlations at the bottom, there is a pretty strong correlation between Indy hub congestion and PJMC congestion. There's a slightly positive correlation between IL hub MCCs and those of PJMC, definitely less than Indy hub. And then if you take a look at MISH hub congestion, there actually is no correlation at all. On the flip side of that, the MIN hub MCCs come in at negative 41% correlation when they're compared to that of PJMC. What we also just want to point out is the spreads between PJMC congestion and the different MISO hubs. They actually look pretty tight. The biggest separation is that of PJMC congestion and that of MISH hub. So from a more macro perspective, if we take a look at the typical flow patterns as they happen throughout the MISO footprint and how congestion moves, we can see the correlation between Indy hub and PJMC in that a west-east movement is really a result of price signals trying to get power to eastern MISO, most notably away from western MISO, to balance out the wind gen that is most prevalent out west. So in this table, we'll take a look at the biggest PJMC and Indy hub daily average real-time MCC spreads. For the most part, we took a look at the top 5 here in this table, the most notable being July 25th, where we saw a negative $14 spread with PJMC congestion coming in just under that of Indy hub. And on the right there, you can see the different drivers as they relate to congestion that we saw that day. What's most notable are the instances of Cumberland Bush congestion on the 25th of July, as well as the 26th of May, which is instance number 3, and then related congestion at West Lafayette to Cumberland, which is basically in the same area, and that was on August the 8th. Something else to take into account is instances number 2 and 4 include interface congestion. Coincidentally, they both happened on the weekend, but if you look at the spread, they're actually opposites of one another, the reason being that the congestion has the opposite effect. The first being an ONT-NICE, the Ontario-New York interface, the second being an ONT-ITC, which is the Ontario-Michigan interface. So now we'll get into some particular constraints of note, the first being the most frequent occurrences where we see bullish PJMC constraints. So the first one we have is quote over to Nelson. Appears as a few different constraints, as you can see in the second column. The driver is typically strong wind generation in Iowa, coupled with weak generation in ComEd, or even weakness in central zone baseload generation, some of the units that we monitor on the Illinois-Indiana scene. The second being Breed to Wheatland, or something similar, Bunsenville to Eugene congestion. The typical drivers there being weakness in baseload generation along the western Indiana border, especially during the morning or the off-peak. Then also we notice that we do see this congestion when there are outages around Kansas or Hudsonville further to the south in southeastern Illinois and southwestern Indiana. The other big one we'd like to look at is Crete St. John. This is has a really, really strong effect. Again, we typically see this when there's weak baseload supply stack in NIPSCO in the northern part of Indiana, or if we see a lack of nuclear output from the Palisades nuke, DC Cook, or even as far east as the Fermi nuke in Detroit. We've also noticed this pops up when we see outages along the state line to Roxana area, or even Roxana to Middle. And we have noticed some smaller outages either at a St. John breaker or at something like Burnham to Munster drive this congestion. So a couple other ones that we want to talk about here are less frequent, but do have a pretty significant impact. Again, turning to the NIPSCO area, Dune Acres to Michigan City. That's typically driven by parallel line outages from Dune Acres to Michigan City. There are 3 lines there, one on the 345 system, the other 2 on the 138 system. And again, we do see this congestion when the Palisades nuke is either derated or out. Another couple ones to mention, further out west, we've got MWEX congestion, which has a pretty strong effect. And then we did touch upon the Ont and Ice congestion at the Ontario-New York interface. Another couple to kind of mention here that do happen, that are actually pretty solid constraints here. Babcock to Stillwell, we have some typical, that's typically driven by the Dumont to Olive outages in the eastern part of NIPSCO. And if you can see, there's a trend here. Whenever Palisades is out or derated, we typically get this kind of congestion. And then the last one is something in Wisconsin, Kenosha to Lakeview, with outages around Arcadian to Pleasant Prairie or that Zion area. On the flip side here, we have some bearish PJMC constraints. The biggest one we've seen is Monroe to Wayne. This is really driven by a pull of power towards Detroit. Sometimes we see imports fall off to that area, and we get this pretty bullish MISO congestion. We've also noticed some work around NSTAR to Monroe, or even just smaller equipment work at Monroe drive this congestion. One that is a little bit counterintuitive that you wouldn't normally see would be Beaver Channel to Rock Creek. That's all the way out in eastern Iowa as you get to ComEd. So we see this congestion when there are outages around Salem or Rock Creek, and then depending on what the demand is in ComEd. And then the last one I'll mention is this North Belding to Virgin constraint. And again, we see this when we have outages in western Michigan, or even the ramp up of Covert or Palisades in the western part of the Lower Peninsula. And finally, we've got kind of a funny one out west, sub 1226 to Tecuma. Typically, we see this with a Grimes to Lehigh outage, or even strong demand up north when the wind is on the weaker side. This does put a downside on PJMC for the most part. Again, a few other ones to just kind of mention on ITC, Sheffield to Marktown, and then kind of a funny one in the middle of Iowa, Power Sheet to the Power Sheet transformer. And then we do have those competing wind-driven constraints in the western part of Indiana, Cumberland to Bush, and the East Winnemac transformer, or Monticello to East Winnemac. So the last thing I'll kind of mention, and what we wanted to take a look at, was how PJMC lines up with some of the other pricing interfaces and pricing points. So what we did take a look at was PJMC as it relates to the PJM MISO point, which is a PJM price node, and also the MISO ONT point, which is a MISO price node. It is worth noting that the ONT point is no longer used, but we did use that kind of as a proxy because we have data for the last 12 years. Now, the most relevant node for interface pricing from Ontario into Michigan is the deco.peaceout node. For the most part, we see a pretty solid correlation between MISO's ONT price and that of PJMC. A little bit less positive correlation with PJMC and PJM's MISO price, and you can see the spreads are pretty tight in general. There is one instance that we recently saw where the ONT price and the deco.peaceout price did not really follow, because for the most part they are pretty much in line. And that was in the last couple of weeks. We saw River Rouge to Marion congestion, as well as Baxter to Warren congestion, which has a bullish effect on MISHub, but a bearish effect on PJMC, IndyHub, as well as the deco.peaceout node. So the last table we'll take here are some of the blowouts that we saw between PJMC and the ONT price. In the middle of March, we saw a pretty solid spread between the two, and that was a result of ONT ITC congestion due to some pretty big line work on the St. Clair to Lambton line. The next one, again, more of that ONT ITC congestion, this time due to the Bunts Creek to Scott outage. And then we did have a couple of instances in late April and late May where we had a very solid positive spread between PJMC and ONT. and that was on account of the Aunt and Nice congestion. In the beginning of October, we did notice a big negative spread due to Michigan City to Maple, as well as Hendricks to U.S. Steel West Mill congestion. And that was on account of some work in Dune Acres to Babcock, as well as Bailey to Dune Acres. So I'm going to turn it back to Lauren. She's going to go over some of the new features regarding PJMC in our reports.
So first here we're going to pull up the Power IQ service, which hopefully many of you are looking at on a daily basis. Just to walk you through how to find this information when you are going through the reports on your time in the morning. First you're going to go ahead and click this Method Valde report link. It's going to take you to the landing page with the Summary tab. To find the congestion impacts for PJMC in the table, you're going to click on the green ribbon at Transmission Congestion. It's going to take you to this page where you have a table, and this is our constraint calls for the Valde. What you're seeing this is listed by our assumed risk for each of these constraints, and then we're organizing that by balancing authority, constraint names. Here we're looking at Prairie State, West Mountain, Vernon at the top, the voltage associated with the constraint, the driver of the constraint, the start and end of the line work we're assuming is driving that, whether or not we think it's wind-driven, and then the effect, which you'll see here, we actually do indicate that the Prairie State, West Mountain, Vernon constraint is bullish on PJMC. And if you scroll down, you do see a couple others coming in and hopefully giving you that kind of trading opportunity on a daily basis. The other thing we showed on the slide before we kind of transition here was the day-ahead and real-time spreads of interest. To get to that, you're going to click on the green ribbon again at Import-Export, and then go to Import-Export Spread. And what we've done here is price the day-ahead spreads between PJMC and many of the interfaces. Here, that PJMC MISO line is actually PJMC minus the MISO interface prices in PJM. And you get that on an hour-by-hour basis, and as well as the max separation and then the average for the 16-hour strip and then the 24-hour strip. Other interface spreads we're including here, we do price the PJMC Aunt spread for the day ahead. We're also looking at Manitoba, and again, just because it is joining later this year, the M2G spread as well. Also going to just do a quick demo here of how some of our new products, most notably a transmission real-time demo here, of how you can actually use that information and apply that to finding PJMC pricing. So what we're going to do here is open up our handy-dandy new interface, which many of you will become familiar with shortly. But here we're seeing a kind of zoom in on Illinois and Indiana and that Fowler wind farm. So here you see the line coming in, and we have Monticello to East Winnemac, which is one of the constraints that John has mentioned, very similar to the Cumberland Bush. And this is one of those lines that you're going to want to watch in order to kind of gauge how much flow is going on here. Let me just check it. So just having a computer difficulty here, it's thinking and wants to load. But as you can see on the graph on the left-hand side here, we are looking at kind of a 3-day spread here since the beginning of the week on Monday through till the end of this week, up until the real time. So what you're seeing here is an increase in flows late last night, and we were seeing a little bit of congestion in that area yesterday. So this is going to be a good way to correlate and see what's going on with that. Beyond that, unfortunately, my pop-up seems to have been blocked, so you can't actually get the pop-up. But what you do see is this kind of popped up, as well as the output from that Fowler Ridge wind farm, which is going to give you kind of a nice correlation between what you're seeing on the generation output side and then the transmission flow side as well. Let's get back into the report here and finish up. Just to summarize, really the big takeaways from this presentation. First, PJMC is a result of that MISO calculated price per unit within PJM. PJMC is closely correlated to real-time LMPs for both Indian and MISH within the MISO footprint. PJMC is not as closely correlated with any of the real-time LMPs within the PJM footprint. When you're looking at flows between PJM and MISO, they are nearly a quarter of all flows in and out of the MISO region, so it's going to have a direct impact on the real-time prices for both India and West Hub. When considering wind generation, you are going to see a negative relationship in the real time with that PJMC LMP. And in order to better predict any real-time flows between MISO and PJM, you're better off looking at kind of overall commitment in both of the regions, MISO and PJM, rather than just using that PJMC prices indicator. And lastly, looking at critical constraints to drive price separation between India and PJMC, you're looking at constraints such as Cordova-Nelson, Jane Acres, Michigan City, Monroe to Wayne, and on ITC. And again, just to wrap everything up, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us both on the GoToWebinar questions. And if you want any more information or a 2-week trial on the MISO or even PJM products, feel free to contact Bob Limp, the head of global sales here at Genscape, to set you up with that Power IQ demo.
It's also available online, genscape.com/free trial, and you can choose any products that you'd like to trial for free. And I think with that, we'll move into some questions.
Okay, so the first question coming to us today is, how do you interpret the day-ahead wind forecast and its impact on PJMC?
So most of the studies we did here were obviously real-time. When looking at the day-ahead, the wind curve normally follows it pretty closely in terms of what our expectations are for real-time wind. You do get those deviations in the real-time, which obviously cause some issues, and my real-time fields have decided to pop up finally. But looking at the day-ahead wind, you are going to see the same kind of constraints making their way into the day-ahead and the same kind of pricing impact. We don't see any different price impacts between the day-ahead and real-time markets when it comes to PJM.
We're also getting a lot of questions about the presentation, which will be made available after we finish up with the Q&A session here today. So if anyone wants to take a further look at that. Next question up is, does Genscape offer any trade ideas for individual MISO nodes?
So we do look at some individual nodes. Obviously, PJMC is still a node, and we are looking at that on a daily basis. More locally, we are looking more on the hubs and primarily focused on that. But the MISO desk does look for the FTR auctions, and we do a month-ahead outlook, which we're going to highlight those top constraint picks for the month. And we're definitely going to be taking a look at the impact on PJMC and some of the other nodes that might be impacted by those particular constraints. So if you are looking for some sort of FTR product, we do have one. And again, feel free to contact Bob Limp or go to the website to sign up for that free trial.
So the next question that comes to us is, looking at those congestion tables, MWEX was only a noticeable constraint that wasn't on the MISO-PJM scene. Do we have any thoughts on why that would drive the MCCs higher there on PJMC?
So looking at that constraint, what we're seeing are prices generally going up in Wisconsin just north of ComEd. And so instead of kind of getting it right on the scene where you are seeing a more direct relationship, you're getting that ComEd to Wisconsin flow instead involved, and that's why we're seeing a deviation. And then looking a little bit more closely at some of those flows with PJM, I know we talked about the MISO interface price, but PJM does divide MISO into 3 subregions. Into first the MISO interface price, which covers the Michigan and NIPSCO area. We're also looking at the Northwest interface, which is pretty much anything north and west of ComEd, so Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota. And then to the south, you're looking around that southern imports and exports line, which for the most part is a very low amount of flows in and out of Indy. So again, taking a look at that, the Northwest interface, you have a decent correlation there at around 40%, and the same for that south import-export. So again, the correlation is not as high as they were with those MISO hub prices, but you are still seeing some movement in the same direction. Any other questions? All right. The next question we're looking at here, looking at for any other factors that might drive flows to change besides that price or commitment level. One thing that does spring to mind for that would be transmission loading release, or TLRs. When a TLR gets called, you do see flows in the real time start getting cut. And for primarily west to east congestion flows, you're looking at things such as IATN or volunteer fitspend TLRs helping to cut those flows from MISO to PJM. So that may also cause a dip in flows without any resulting congestion. and/or purchase.
And with that, any more questions to the team? Okay. This concludes the MISO webinar. We thank everyone for joining us. Again, the slides will be sent to all registrants tomorrow, and so no worries there. We'll get the slides out. Thank you again, and have a